Global alert. The conflict in Lebanon continues to escalate with new explosions which, according to early reports, are not related to those that occurred in previous days, but contribute to the growing instability. These explosions have caused great concern in the international community due to the type of explosives used, suggesting an escalation in the sophistication of the attacks and the violence in the region. Local authorities are struggling to control the situation, but their efforts have been insufficient in the face of the magnitude of the chaos and the mistrust that prevails among the factions involved. The tension not only affects civilians whose daily lives are severely disrupted by the conflict, but also political actors and armed groups with different goals, each seeking to take advantage of the situation to gain strategic advantages. The explosions have left a considerable number of victims, including both civilians and military personnel, which has increased alarms in the international community. Several organizations have issued condemnations, calling for peace and dialogue, but on the ground, the reality is that the warring factions are more focused on intensifying their attacks than on seeking diplomatic solutions. There are fears that the conflict, if not contained, could spread to other countries in the Middle East, further destabilizing a region already hit by multiple wars and political tensions. The possibility of a larger confrontation between foreign powers is also on the table, as several of these countries see the conflict as an opportunity to strengthen their influence in the area, further complicating efforts to achieve a peaceful resolution. In the midst of this situation, Lebanese citizens are trapped, suffering the consequences of a conflict that seems to have no end. The streets of the country's main cities are filled with rubble, and daily life has been deeply disrupted. Many have lost their homes, their jobs, and even their loved ones, and uncertainty about the future has gripped the population. In addition, the economic collapse that already plagued the country before the escalation of the conflict has worsened, leaving many without access to the basic goods and services needed to survive. The political system in Lebanon, which was already fractured, is now even more divided. Internal factions cannot agree on how to handle the situation, and attempts to form a unity government have been frustrated by the deep divisions that run through the different political and religious groups that make up the Lebanese landscape. Popular protests, which in the past had been a sign of hope for change, have been violently suppressed or have simply vanished in the face of the magnitude of the current challenges. Meanwhile, people's despair grows, and many are beginning to consider emigration as their only way out. Internationally, several countries and organizations have offered humanitarian aid, but the distribution of this assistance has been hampered by the control that various armed groups have over different parts of the country. In addition, rampant corruption within the government has prevented many of these resources from reaching those who need them most, which has generated growing frustration among the population. Despite efforts by some non-governmental organizations to bring supplies to the most affected areas, the roads are fraught with danger and the chances of aid arriving safely are dwindling. The role of foreign powers in this conflict is also a cause for concern. While some countries have offered diplomatic and logistical support, others are using the war as an opportunity to expand their influence in the region. This power play has complicated attempts at international mediation, as each actor has its own interests and none seem willing to give ground. Negotiations for a ceasefire have repeatedly failed, and although there have been calls for all parties involved to come to the dialogue table, the reality is that none of them seem willing to do so at this time. Many have had to flee their homes, seeking refuge in other countries or in areas less affected by the conflict. But the capacity of these areas is limited and the conditions are extremely difficult. Refugee camps are overflowing, and the people living in them face a chronic lack of food, clean water, and medical care. Children in particular are the most vulnerable, as many have been orphaned or separated from their families, and schools are closed or destroyed, preventing their education and development. The psychological impact of the conflict is also significant. Both adults and children suffer the aftermath of trauma, and stories of people who have lost family members or who have witnessed acts of unimaginable violence are increasingly common. Although some organizations have tried to offer psychological support, the demand is overwhelming and resources are scarce. The international community has called for increased assistance in this area, but the lack of security and logistical difficulties make it extremely difficult to carry out these initiatives. The future of Lebanon is uncertain. While some remain hopeful that the conflict can be resolved through international intervention or an agreement between the warring parties, the reality is that the situation seems to be out of control. With each passing day, the country sinks further into chaos, and the chances of a peaceful solution seem increasingly remote. Citizens, exhausted by years of violence and economic crisis, look to the future with a mixture of despair and resignation as the cycle of violence continues its unstoppable course. The consequences of this conflict are not limited to Lebanon. If a solution is not found soon, instability is likely to spread to other neighboring countries, which could trigger an even bigger crisis across the region. Furthermore, the flow of refugees to Europe and other countries is already increasing, which could have significant repercussions in terms of migration policy and global security. Analysts agree that a coordinated effort by the international community is needed to stop this spiral of violence, but so far, attempts to reach a consensus have failed. In short, Lebanon is facing a deep and multidimensional crisis that involves not only internal actors, but also foreign powers with interests in the region. The civilian population is the most affected by a conflict that seems to have no end, and the prospects for a peaceful solution are increasingly distant. The international community continues to look for ways to intervene, but the situation on the ground is extremely complicated, and the divisions between the warring parties seem insurmountable. Meanwhile, the country continues to crumble, mired in a cycle of violence, despair, and destruction that threatens to drag the entire region into the abyss.